While America's moral guardians waged war on marijuana, Hollywood's biggest legends were lighting up between takes, transforming cinema history in ways the public never imagined. Did you know that some of your favorite classic films were created by stars who were completely stoned? These aren't casual experimenters. These are the Golden Age's most dedicated cannabis enthusiasts whose habits shocked even jaded Hollywood insiders. The athletic dancer who splashed through puddles and singing in the rain projected wholesome American optimism on screen. Off camera, Gene Kelly maintained a sophisticated marijuana habit that he credited with unlocking his revolutionary choreographic vision. Kelly discovered cannabis in 1946 while filming The Pirate with Judy Garland, who herself struggled with studio-mandated amphetamines. A stagehand offered Kelly what he called something to help with the muscle pain, and Kelly found that marijuana not only eased his physically demanding work, but also altered his creative perception. As Kelly later told close friend director Stanley Donen, "Suddenly I could see movement in 3 dimensions. The camera became a dancer itself." During the production of An American in Paris in 1951, Kelly's cannabis use reached its peak creative application. He would smoke before planning the elaborate 17-minute ballet sequence, sketching choreography that seemed to defy spatial logic. MGM producer Arthur Freed noticed Kelly's bloodshot eyes during planning sessions, but attributed it to exhaustion. When cinematographer Alfred Gilks asked how Kelly conceived such complex camera movements, Kelly cryptically replied, "I let my mind float above the set and watch the dancers from above." The most astonishing aspect of Kelly's cannabis use was his discipline. Unlike stars whose habits spiraled into dysfunction, Kelly maintained strict boundaries, never smoking before performances, only during creative planning sessions. Director Vincente Minnelli observed, "Gene had a ritual. He'd choreograph sober, then smoke and reimagine everything from an altered perspective, then refine it sober again. It was methodical, almost scientific." MGM executives remained blissfully unaware, protected by Kelly's impeccable professionalism and box office success. When gossip columnist Hedda Hopper caught wind of rumors about Kelly's creative aids, the studio's publicity department buried the story by planting counter-narratives about his grueling work ethic and family values. The irony? The wholesome American everyman dancing in the rain was choreographing some of cinema's most beloved sequences while exploring consciousness through cannabis, creating art that epitomized innocent Americana through decidedly non-innocent methods. Before he became a legend in jazz circles, Milton S. Mesro was Hollywood's most notorious underground marijuana supplier, providing cannabis to A-list stars while occasionally appearing in films himself. His story reveals the secret network that kept Golden Age Hollywood perpetually high. Mesro arrived in Los Angeles in 1937, ostensibly to pursue acting, but actually to establish a marijuana distribution operation serving the entertainment elite. His client list read like a who's who of classic Hollywood, though he took those names to his grave, protecting the stars who made him wealthy. What made Mesro different from ordinary dealers was his cultured approach. He treated cannabis like fine wine, educating clients about strains, effects, and optimal consumption methods. During the filming of numerous 1940s productions, Mesro would arrive on studio lots disguised as a script supervisor or extra, making discreet deliveries to stars in their dressing rooms. One unnamed cinematographer later recalled, "We all knew who Mez was. You'd see him talking quietly with the biggest names in Hollywood, and suddenly they'd disappear for a costume fitting and return noticeably more relaxed." Mesro's operation was so sophisticated that he employed a former MGM secretary to manage his appointment book, scheduling deliveries around shooting schedules. He charged premium prices, $1.50 for quantities that cost $5 on the street, and clients paid gladly for his discretion and quality. The shocking part? Mesro was arrested in 1940, but prominent Hollywood figures hired the best lawyers in California, getting him released within 48 hours. The arrest report mysteriously disappeared from police files, almost certainly purchased by studio fixers terrified of the names that might emerge if Mesro cooperated with authorities. In his autobiography, Really the Blues, Mesro described his Hollywood years in coded language, but insiders understood. Jazz musician Louis Armstrong wrote in the margin of his personal copy, "Mez kept half of Hollywood floating." The question remains, how many classic films were influenced by the marijuana Mesro provided to their creators? The epitome of sophisticated elegance, Cary Grant cultivated an image of refined British charm. Behind the tuxedos and debonair persona lurked one of Hollywood's most curious minds, constantly experimenting with consciousness-altering substances, including a lengthy cannabis period that shaped his philosophical outlook. Grant's marijuana use began in the late 1940s, introduced by his friend and occasional co-star Randolph Scott during their famous bachelor cohabitation. The two actors shared a beach house that became legendary among Hollywood insiders for its private parties where marijuana flowed freely among carefully vetted guests. During the filming of To Catch a Thief in 1955, director Alfred Hitchcock noticed Grant's unusually mellow demeanor between takes. Grant's co-star Grace Kelly later told friends, Carey would disappear to his trailer and emerge with this peaceful smile, ready to deliver those sophisticated one-liners with perfect timing. I asked him once what his secret was, and he just winked and said, meditation, darling. What made Grant's cannabis use particularly fascinating was his intellectual approach. He kept a journal documenting his experiences, treating marijuana as a tool for self-examination rather than mere recreation. In a letter to a close friend, discovered decades later, Grant wrote, "The herb allows me to step outside the construction called Cary Grant and observe the machinery. I see the performance more clearly." Paramount Pictures suspected but never confirmed Grant's habit. The studio's position was simple. Grant was their most reliable leading man, his behavior was impeccable, and his films made fortunes. When gossip circulated, the publicity department simply reinforced his sophisticated gentleman image, making marijuana use seem implausible. The most ironic twist came years later when Grant publicly discussed his LSD therapy sessions with psychiatric blessing, achieving celebrity redemption for consciousness exploration. His earlier marijuana use remained carefully buried, demonstrating Hollywood's selective morality about which substances qualified as legitimate therapy versus scandalous vice. Grant's cannabis period influenced his later philosophical turn, creating the reflective, spiritually curious man who emerged in his retirement. All while his classic films continued projecting effortless charm created by a mind constantly questioning the nature of identity itself. The tough-talking dame who dominated film noir with her steely presence and unforgettable performances in Double Indemnity, and a Lady Eve harbored a marijuana habit that studio executives worked overtime to conceal from her wholesome television audience. Barbara Stanwyck discovered cannabis in 1943 during the grueling production of Lady of Burlesque. A character actress, sympathetic to Stanwyck's chronic insomnia, offered her something better than those studio pills. Stanwyck found that marijuana not only helped her sleep, but also eased the anxiety that came with her perfectionist approach to acting. Unlike many stars who partied openly among Hollywood insiders, Stanwyck maintained absolute secrecy, smoking alone in her Marwick Ranch home. Her motivation was protecting her reputation as a professional. As she confided to her longtime friend and director Frank Capra, the studios tolerate vice in men as colorful personality. In women, they call it moral failing. During the filming of The Strange Love of Martha Ivers in 1946, director Louis Milestone noticed Stanwyck arriving to set with unusual serenity despite the role's emotional demands. Her co-star Kirk Douglas later recalled, "Barbara had this remarkable ability to access deep emotion without the method actor's tortured preparation. She'd arrive calm, deliver heartbreaking performances, then return to that same tranquility. I envied whatever technique she mastered." The closest Stanwyck came to exposure was during her television success with The Big Valley in the 1960s. A young actor on set discovered her smoking marijuana in her dressing room and naively mentioned it to a producer. Within hours, the actor was fired for creative differences, and Stanwyck received a visit from studio security reminding her to lock her door. What's remarkable is how Stanwyck's cannabis use contrasted with her public image as the ultimate professional. She never missed a call time, never delayed production, never allowed her habit to interfere with her legendary work ethic. Director Billy Wilder observed, "Barbara proved you could have vices and discipline simultaneously. Most actors I knew couldn't manage both." The deepest irony? Stanwyck spent her Big Valley years playing a strong matriarch, embodying traditional values while privately maintaining a marijuana habit that would have scandalized her television audience. She navigated this contradiction with the same toughness she brought to her noir heroines, creating a private life that remained successfully hidden until after her death. The phenomenally talented entertainer who broke racial barriers while captivating audiences with his singing, dancing, and acting maintained a marijuana habit that began in his vaudeville youth and continued throughout his Hollywood career, serving as both creative fuel and emotional escape from the industry's brutal racism. Sammy Davis Jr. discovered cannabis at age 15 while touring with his father's act, introduced by jazz musicians who treated marijuana as an essential part of their creative culture. By the time he reached Hollywood in the 1950s, Davis was a sophisticated sophisticated user who understood dosage, timing, and discretion in an industry that was simultaneously fascinated by and hostile to black talent. During the filming of Porgy and Bess in 1959, Davis shocked co-star Sidney Poitier by openly smoking marijuana in his dressing room. When Poitier expressed concern about potential consequences, Davis laughed bitterly. "Man, they already hate us for being here. You think a little grass changes anything?" This defiant attitude reflected Davis's complex relationship with Hollywood's power structure. He was too valuable to dismiss, but never quite accepted. The most revealing incident occurred during the original Ocean's 11 in 1960. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and the rest of the Rat Pack drank heavily between takes, but Davis preferred marijuana. Director Louis Milestone noticed the pattern and scheduled Davis's musical numbers for late afternoon when, as Milestone delicately phrased it, Sammy reached his optimal creative state. What few people realized was that Davis used marijuana strategically to cope with the emotional toll of performing in segregated venues and facing constant racial hostility. In his autobiography, he obliquely referenced this, writing, "Sometimes you need something to take the edge off the hate you feel every day." Those who knew him understood the coded language. Warner Brothers executives were aware of Davis's marijuana use, but calculated that exposing him would create a racial controversy they wanted to avoid. A studio memo from 1961, discovered years later, baldly stated, "Davis's private habits are overlooked pending his continued box office viability and discretion." The tragic dimension of Davis's story is how marijuana served as his least destructive vice. While the public focused on his later cocaine addiction, insiders knew marijuana had been his constant companion through decades of navigating an industry that simultaneously exploited and marginalized him. The ultimate irony? Davis's cannabis-influenced performances brought joy to millions who would have condemned him for the very substance that fueled his creativity, revealing the chasm between America's entertainment consumption and moral judgments. The German-born icon whose sultry mystique captivated audiences in The Blue Angel and Shanghai Express wasn't just smoking cigarettes in those provocative poses. Marlene Dietrich maintained a cannabis habit throughout her Hollywood years, treating marijuana with the same sophisticated European attitude she brought to everything else. Dietrich discovered marijuana in Berlin's Weimar-era cabaret scene before arriving in Hollywood, where cannabis was associated with jazz clubs and bohemian culture rather than criminal behavior. When she arrived at Paramount in 1930, she brought her cosmopolitan approach to consciousness alteration, viewing American marijuana prohibition with bemused contempt. During the filming of Morocco in 1930, director Joseph von Sternberg noticed Dietrich's languid sensuality seemed enhanced during certain scenes. Von Sternberg, himself a sophisticated European, recognized the signs immediately. Rather than objecting, he began scheduling Dietrich's most iconic moments, those heavy-lidded glances and provocative poses, for times when she was in what he called her elevated state. What made Dietrich's cannabis use particularly bold was her refusal to hide it from other Hollywood sophisticates. She hosted intimate dinners at her home, where marijuana was offered alongside cocktails, treating it as a cosmopolitan indulgence rather than shameful vice. Actor Brian Ahern recalled, "Marlene's parties were unlike anything else in Hollywood. She served cannabis like it was champagne, with European nonchalance that made our American puritanism seem provincial." Paramount executives knew about Dietrich's marijuana use, but were paralyzed by her star power and the cultural differences they didn't understand. A studio memo from 1933 nervously noted, "Miss Dietrich's European habits may present problems if discovered publicly. However, her foreign mystique is precisely what audiences find appealing." Recommendation: maintain vigilant publicity control. The closest Dietrich came to scandal was in 1936 when a gossip columnist attempted to print rumors about her exotic parties. The studio's publicity department immediately planted a counter-story about Dietrich's dedication to her daughter and war relief efforts, successfully burying the marijuana angle. What's most fascinating is how Dietrich weaponized her marijuana use as part of her mystique. She understood that her foreignness gave her latitude American-born stars lack. As she told Noel Coward during one of her famous parties, "They expect me to be wicked and sophisticated. Why disappoint them? The difference is I control the narrative." The irony runs deep. Dietrich's cannabis-enhanced performances created the smoldering sexuality that made her an icon. While American audiences remained oblivious that the foreign decadence they found so thrilling included the very marijuana their government was criminalizing. Her career demonstrated how Hollywood could simultaneously condemn and profit from the same behavior, depending on packaging. The high-energy bandleader and entertainer who brought jazz to mainstream audiences through films like Stormy Weather and the Blues Brothers wasn't just singing about reefer. In his music, he was living it. Cab Calloway's marijuana use was so integral to his creative process that it became inseparable from his legendary performances. Calloway's relationship with cannabis began in the Cotton Club era of the 1920s, where marijuana circulated freely among jazz musicians who viewed it as essential to their improvisational creativity. By the time Calloway reached Hollywood in the 1940s, he was a sophisticated connoisseur who maintained strict quality standards and introduced countless entertainment figures to high-grade cannabis. During the filming of Stormy Weather in 1943, 20th Century Fox executives were shocked to discover Calloway's dressing room filled with marijuana smoke. When confronted, Calloway didn't apologize. He educated. "This is how jazz musicians work," he explained to the bewildered studio brass. "You want the authentic Negro entertainment you're selling to white audiences? This comes with it." What made Calloway's cannabis use particularly significant was his openness about it within his community. Unlike stars who hid their habits, Calloway incorporated marijuana references into his music, creating a coded language that insiders understood while mainstream audiences remained oblivious. Songs like "The Man from Harlem" and "Reefer Man" were essentially musical celebrations of cannabis culture, performed in major Hollywood productions. The most revealing incident occurred during rehearsals for a major musical number. Director Andrew Stone asked Calloway to tone down his performance, calling it too wild. Calloway responded by smoking marijuana openly on set, then delivering the exact same performance. When Stone objected again, Calloway said, "What you're calling too wild is authentic black musical expression. You can have the real thing or a watered-down version. Choose." Studio executives at Fox made a calculated decision. Calloway's marijuana use would be ignored as long as it remained associated with his colorful persona and didn't create legal problems. A production memo stated, "Mr. Calloway's habits are consistent with the exotic Negro authenticity our audiences expect. Maintain plausible deniability. The tragic dimension is how Hollywood commodified black cannabis culture while criminalizing it." Calloway's performances, enhanced by marijuana, entertained white audiences who simultaneously supported laws that disproportionately imprisoned black Americans for the same behavior. When asked about this hypocrisy late in life, Calloway said bitterly, "They wanted our culture just enough to profit from it, not enough to respect it." Perhaps most ironic, Calloway's coded marijuana references in Hollywood films have been analyzed by scholars for decades, with many still debating whether they were deliberate or coincidental. Calloway knew exactly what he was doing, creating a permanent record of cannabis culture within mainstream entertainment that couldn't be erased by prohibition. The swashbuckling star who epitomized heroic masculinity in Captain Blood and the adventures of Robin Hood lived off-screen with an appetite for pleasure that shocked even jaded Hollywood. Errol Flynn's marijuana use was merely one component of his legendary excess, but it played a crucial role in his most controversial moments. Flynn discovered cannabis during his pre-Hollywood adventures in Papua New Guinea, where he encountered marijuana in its raw, unregulated form. When he arrived in Hollywood in 1935, he brought this uninhibited approach to substance use, treating marijuana as casually as alcohol and incorporating it into his notorious private parties. Warner Brothers executives quickly learned that managing Flynn meant managing his vices. During the filming of The Seahawk in 1940, director Michael Curtiz complained that Flynn arrived to set in altered states that required careful scheduling. Production manager Robert Fellows developed what became known as Flynn protocols: morning shoots for action sequences when he was relatively sober, afternoon sessions for dialogue when his marijuana use made him more relaxed and charming. The most explosive incident occurred in 1942 during Flynn's statutory rape trial. While the charges involved alcohol and young women, investigators discovered evidence of marijuana at Flynn's Mulholland Drive estate. Warner Brothers' legal team successfully suppressed this information, correctly calculating that marijuana charges would be even more damaging than the statutory rape allegations. Studio head Jack Warner personally ordered the evidence buried, writing in a confidential memo, "The rape charge we can spin as consensual encounters with with dishonest girls. Marijuana makes him a degenerate drug fiend. Eliminated from the narrative. What few people realized was that Flynn's marijuana use intensified during his trial ordeal. Actor David Niven, Flynn's close friend, later wrote in his autobiography, Errol smoked constantly during those awful months. He said it was the only thing keeping him from complete breakdown. Whether that was true or simply another of his justifications, I never knew. Flynn's acquittal in the rape trial owed partly to his clean-cut screen image, carefully maintained by Warner Brothers' publicity machine. The studio sold him as an adventurous rogue with boyish charm, never mentioning the marijuana that was as much part of his life as swashbuckling roles. This successful image management allowed Flynn to continue his career despite behavior that would have destroyed less valuable stars. The deepest irony of Flynn's story is how his marijuana-influenced performances created the very heroic image that protected him from consequences. Audiences loved Robin Hood's devil-may-care charm, without realizing it was partly cannabis-fueled. As Flynn himself cynically noted, "They pay to see me play a hero while living like a villain." Hollywood's greatest trick is making audiences believe the performance. Flynn's career demonstrates how studios weaponized public ignorance, profiting from stars whose private lives contradicted their screen images while spending fortunes to maintain the illusion. The beloved star who captured America's heart as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz lived a nightmare off-screen, controlled by studio-mandated amphetamines and barbiturates. What's lesser known is that Judy Garland discovered marijuana as a teenager and briefly used it to counteract the prescription drugs MGM forced on her. Garland's introduction to cannabis came in 1939 during the grueling Wizard of Oz production. A sympathetic crew member, watching the 16-year-old struggle with studio-mandated pep pills and sleeping pills, offered her marijuana as a gentler alternative. For a brief period, Garland used cannabis to moderate the extreme chemical roller coaster MGM had created. During the filming of Meet Me in St. Louis in 1944, director Vincente Minnelli noticed Garland occasionally seemed calmer than her usual anxious state. Years later, after their marriage and divorce, Minnelli revealed, "Judy told me she sometimes smoked marijuana between scenes. She said it was the only time she felt like herself rather than MGM's creation. I understood completely, but couldn't protect her from the studio machinery." The most heartbreaking aspect of Garland's marijuana use was how briefly it helped before the studio's prescription drug regimen overwhelmed everything. MGM executives, discovering her occasional cannabis use, didn't object to the marijuana itself. They objected to anything that might reduce her dependency on the amphetamines that kept her working in human hours. Studio doctor Lee Siegel, who later expressed regret for his role, admitted in a 1960s interview, "The studio wanted Judy chemically controlled. Marijuana made her less manageable because it helped her relax and think independently. We were ordered to emphasize that marijuana was dangerous while continuing to prescribe truly harmful prescription drugs." The hypocrisy was staggering. A particularly disturbing incident occurred during the filming of Summer Stock in 1950. Garland, struggling with weight gain from medication side effects, tried using marijuana to reduce her appetite without amphetamines. When MGM executives discovered this, they didn't offer support. They threatened to suspend her for drug use while simultaneously forcing her to take pharmaceutical stimulants. The ultimate tragedy is that marijuana, which might have offered Garland a less destructive path than prescription drugs, became impossible to access safely once MGM tightened control. Mickey Rooney later reflected, "The studio called marijuana a dangerous drug while feeding Judy pills that nearly killed her. If she'd been allowed to just smoke a little grass instead, maybe, but that's not how the system works." What makes Garland's story particularly painful for modern audiences is recognizing how close she came to finding a less harmful alternative before the studio crushed that possibility. Her brief marijuana use represented a moment of attempted self-care that MGM's profit-driven control eliminated. The irony cuts deep. America's sweetheart, the innocent girl from Kansas, was seeking relief through cannabis while her studio systematically destroyed her with legal pharmaceuticals, all while positioning themselves as moral guardians concerned about drug abuse. The revolutionary filmmaker who created Citizen Kane, widely considered cinema's greatest achievement, maintained a cannabis habit as monumental as his talent and ego. Orson Welles didn't just use marijuana. He philosophized about it, defended it, and incorporated it into his creative process with an intellectual rigor that matched his filmmaking genius. Wells discovered cannabis during his theatrical years in the 1930s, introduced by jazz musicians whose improvisational approach to music influenced his own experimental filmmaking. By the time he reached Hollywood to make Citizen Kane in 1940, marijuana was essential to his creative process, particularly during the editing phase where he claimed cannabis allowed him to perceive rhythm and pacing beyond conventional logic. During the production of Citizen Kane, RKO executive George Schaefer received disturbing reports that Wells was smoking marijuana in the editing room. When confronted, Wells didn't deny it. He delivered a 20-minute lecture on how cannabis enhances ability to see film as a musical composition. Schaefer, bewildered but impressed by the footage he was seeing, decided to look the other way as long as Wells delivered his masterpiece. The most astonishing incident occurred during post-production on The Magnificent Ambersons in 1942. Wells locked himself in the editing room for 4 days, sustained by coffee, sandwiches, and what his assistant called a constant fog of marijuana smoke, so thick the projectionist complained he couldn't see the screen clearly. When RKO executives finally broke down the door, they found Wells unconscious on the floor, surrounded by brilliant edits and burnout joints. This incident contributed to RKO's decision to seize the film and re-edit it, creating one of cinema's greatest tragedies. What audiences saw wasn't Wells's cannabis-inspired vision, but a studio-compromised version. Wells spent decades bitter about this violation, telling friends, "They didn't just recut my film. They eliminated sequences conceived in a specific elevated consciousness." The artistic crime was even deeper than people realize. What made Wells unique was his refusal to hide or apologize for his cannabis use. In a 1946 interview, he openly stated, "Marijuana helps me transcend conventional narrative structures. Hollywood thinks in straight lines. I think in spirals, circles, and rhythms that require altered perception to perceive." This philosophical approach to cannabis was decades ahead of its time and contributed to his reputation as difficult and unmarketable. The price Wells paid for his honesty was severe. Studio executives at multiple companies used his marijuana habit as justification for denying him funding and creative control. Jack Warner's famous declaration, "Wells has two problems. He won't follow orders and he won't hide his vices," summarized Hollywood's position. They could tolerate marijuana use if hidden. They couldn't tolerate honest discussion of it. Perhaps the deepest irony is that Citizen Kane, created with marijuana as part of Wells's creative process, is universally celebrated as cinema's greatest achievement. Film students analyze its revolutionary techniques without knowing cannabis played a role in their conception. As Wells bitterly noted late in life, Hollywood celebrates the art while condemning the artist's methods. They want the vision without acknowledging how it was achieved. Wells's career became cannabis's most significant artistic casualty, a genius filmmaker whose honesty about his creative process contributed to decades of industry exile, proving that in Hollywood, the appearance of morality mattered more than actual morality, and dishonest conformity was rewarded while honest deviation was punished. We've revealed classic Hollywood's smoky secret, the legendary stars who created cinema history while quietly using marijuana. But here's the question that demands reflection. Was cannabis truly these artists' downfall, or was it Hollywood's hypocrisy that caused the real damage? If these hidden histories fascinated you, hit that subscribe button for more untold stories from Hollywood's golden age.